The music had been arranged not to intrude. It hovered, if one can say so of sound, at shoulder height among the mirrors and the gilt, falling away when a glass was set down and returning, like a discreet guest when no one needed it. Lady Honoria Vale, whose drawing-room had once received foreign secretaries and now, more frequently, painters and actresses and men who ran trusts, had a gift for such imperceptible management. She stood under the chandelier as if it were an umbrella in sunlight, and spoke to a man from the Foreign Office as though nothing more was at stake than the arrangement of roses in the marble bowl behind her. The roses had been chosen with a careful indifference, all of them white. From the tall windows, Belgrave Square returned a dark, polite gaze. There were carriages in the old days. Tonight, a small procession of motor cars whispered past the railings and drew up, one by one, under the fanlight, the Ashfield Bentley with its livery soberly cut, a contralto of a Daimler concerned with its own dignity, a low black Jaguar that sidled like a handsome cat. The butler, Maddox, who had served in 2 houses called Vale, took hats and gloves with the resigned benevolence of a cleric, and found places for walking sticks with an attention that included their owners, but did not, in any way, flatter them. Lord Ngaio Marsh, the footman announced, and released into the room a youngish man who, by the most economical of gestures, made the room aware that he belonged in it. He was not handsome. His nose was a shade too thin and his eyelids a shade too composed. He controlled his face as one controls a horse watched by strangers. Lady Honoria gave him her hand and, very slightly, her attention. Lord Ivor, Maddox will have shown you. The claret is the 22. I sent to Cambridge for the Stilton, though I expect that's become a vulgarity. You see everyone? Sir Lionel, of course. There is Mr. Pardoe, who is a lawyer in the saddest sense, and... She lifted her chin toward the end of the room where a tall object under a muslin drape stood as if about to address them. The cause of it all. We have half a mind to wait. The other half is stubbornly impatient. The other half will prevail, Lord Ivor said. She is late? Lady Honoria's smile was a small folded thing. Miss Loxham is at the mercy of drivers. She prefers to drive herself, said Mr. Pardoe, appearing with the inevitability of an accountant's nib. He was careful about the ways in which he made himself noticeable. A camel-hair jacket too large for him in that particular way lawyers choose when they mean to indicate they are not entirely lawyers. A lock of hair that never quite settled. Thoughtful spectacles that could be taken off to signify thought. He bowed to Lady Honoria, bent his head to Lord Ivor, and then added, with the relish of accuracy, the weather made an excuse for anyone to be late. The pavements are as treacherous as a committee. The weather had been busy all day, composing a polite drizzle for London. It had left no mark upon the square, which was green and immaculate, as though rain were an arrangement made between it and Maddox. Verity can be late and be forgiven, said Dame Celia Hartwell, who had once made a generation cry with a single turn of the head, and had found no reason in later life to turn in any other manner. She had large pearls at her throat with a personality of their own, and a laugh like a rehearsal. That is one of the charms of money. It lacks imagination, but it is patient, rather like dogs. Or the army, said Sir Lionel Vane, who had the air of having been put together by a very careful tailor out of pieces he did not entirely trust. He spoke as if he had always worn a uniform, even when he had worn none. We made do with late things often enough. The trouble was, when they arrived, we generally wished they hadn't. Do we wish this? Asked Julian Frobisher, materializing at Dame Celia's elbow in a cloud of expensive indifference. The painter's hair had been pulled forward into a consideration of itself. He had a mouth that had kissed, one felt, more theories than women. I have done her the kindness of leaving truth undisturbed. It will shock her. Come, Lady Honoria said softly. She is young. That is no defect, Frobisher returned. Merely a condition. He lifted the corner of the muslin that covered the portrait with the behavior of a child peeking at forbidden jam. There. "Don't," said Mr. Pardoe sharply. And then, aware he had spoken sharply to an artist in a room arranged by a hostess, moderated it at once. "After all, there is a ritual." "Rituals," said Lord Ivor, "are for people who have time." "Then we shall provide it," said Lady Honoria, in a tone that took back her hand from his arm without removing it. They moved as the English do when something, not yet an event, has made itself comfortable among them. They created space without admitting they were making it. A pair of young women in pale dresses moved towards the tea table and away again, as if in ballet. A dean, who had been invited partly for his kindness, but chiefly for the ornamental quality of his linen collar, told Maddox he would allow himself a second glass of sherry. And the small talk became smaller, not as a river shrinks in drought, but as a thread pulled fine to test its strength. "Maddox," Lady Honoria said, as if she had not said Maddox 1,000 times before in rooms from which he had removed 1,000 ashtrays. "There has been no message." "From Miss Loxham's house, my lady." The butler's voice did not suggest that messages interested him. "No, my lady. I took the call at 7:15. The motor left Loxham House at 10 minutes to 7. "Perdita was with her," said Dame Celia. "One must forgive her. Companions are never punctual. They have read so many moral essays on the importance of promptness that they feel obliged to be late." "There would have been," Mr. Pardoe observed, "the matter of the trustees. There is always the matter of the trustees. Methodical men have a sense of humor, but it is conscientious." "Ah, yes," said Lady Honoria. "Mr. Blythe is among the methodical?" "He is among the extinct," said Mr. Pardoe with an almost tender dryness. "But his memorandum breathes. One cannot but admire the vitality of the dead." Lord Ivor, who had moved towards the window, had his back to them. He was looking into the square with a concentration that made the pavement outside seem oddly responsible. "This is pointless," he said to the glass. "Verity should be told not to play the child. It is—" He stopped, as if aware of a failure of taste. "It is inconvenient." "Lord Ivor," said Sir Lionel Vane, "has a sense of time more rigorous than mine. I am glad of it. It is what you like in a bridge partner." "Will you cut me then, Sir Lionel?" Dame Celia inquired, extending a small hand with an aging coquetry that made no apology for itself. "Not at bridge," said Sir Lionel. "In other circumstances, I might." There was a laugh, very civilized and very slightly edged. Perdita Grey came at that moment, moving quickly and then, it seemed, remembering something, moving slowly. She was a slender person with a face you might call nice and leave it at that, and eyes that denied you the improvement. She had the air of having been taught to be useful without being noticed, which, this evening, made her noticeable at once. "My lady," she said to Lady Honoria, and then to Mr. Pardoe and to Lord Ivor. She made the sort of compact curtsy that belongs in nurseries and in private tragedies. "Verity asked me to come on. The traffic was abominable by the park. She wished me to say she sent me on because she was anxious not to keep you waiting." "Good," said Lord Ivor too quickly. "She will be 5 minutes behind you." Perdita's hands, which had been perfectly still, let the muff she held twist slightly. "Yes. No. She thought perhaps—" Perdita stopped. "She thought perhaps it would be appropriate if I were here to assist Madame Léonie." She indicated the formidable dressmaker who had, like the chandelier, made a world for herself under Lady Honoria's roof. "With the fastening of the train, she felt a hook might be troublesome. I came by taxi." "Then Miss Loxham is now what? At the house?" asked Mr. Pardoe, with a small, exact smile. "Yes," Perdita said, and then amended it, obedient to honesty. "Yes, she was. She sent me from Hyde Park Corner. She wanted to drive herself." "Of course she did," said Dame Celia, "and if she cannot, she will sell the car." Mr. Frobisher regarded Perdita with an interest that had nothing to do with kindness. "And how much time," he said, does the fastening of a hook require in Belgrave Square?" "Painter," Sir Lionel murmured, not unkindly. "Sometimes wish to remain painters." Lady Honoria saw what Perdita would not say and made a bridge with it. "My dear child, you look chilled. Maddox, for Miss Grey a glass of the Madeira, the old Verdelho." She turned, under cover of this, to Mr. Pardo. "You see, we may as well set the soup back. The portrait will consent to wait." "Will it?" Frobisher said. "Truth, Lady Honoria, is an animal that tires of being tethered. It has had too little practice of late." Mr. Pardo returned, and received for this a quick, cold look from Lord Ivor. Conversation, which had been made to stand still, began again to walk. It did not run. The arrangement at the end of the room, an easel as respectable as a butler, the muslin with its modesty, insisted on its own existence. It drew eyes as a white door draws a moth. Maurice Loxham arrived, half a minute after Perdita, with rain on the shoulders of a very pretty overcoat. He kissed Lady Honoria's hand with a care for the observation of the room, looked at Lord Ivor as one looks at someone one expects to meet against one's will in a club, and at Mr. Pardo as one looks at one's laundry list. "Verity?" he said to Perdita, with that small, effective cousinage that has the effect of making women feel cleverer and men less liked. "She is behind me," Perdita said. "She will be here in a moment." "Ah," said Maurice. He glanced at the covered portrait and smiled with frank appreciation. "We shall all be introduced anew. How very modern." "You, my dear Maurice," said Lady Honoria, "are pleased only to be introduced to yourself." "It is a charming acquaintance," Maurice replied. Maddox, who did not intervene in drawing-room matters with his mouth when he could avoid it, approached Lady Honoria with a slight inclination which, read rightly, meant, "I am about to speak to you in public because I cannot speak to you in private." "My lady," he said, not raising his voice, "there is a telephone." "From Miss Loxham?" Lady Honoria asked, and with the question a silence came down as if someone had shut a door in a distant passage. Maddox improved his bow by the breadth of an eyelash. "From Loxham House, the maid says." He paused and considered, with a very old-fashioned delicacy, what could be said in a room where a train of silk and lace waited in its own room upstairs like a tame cloud. "She says that Miss Loxham's motor returned," he said carefully. "Returned?" Mr. Pardo repeated. "Without Miss Loxham," said Maddox. The silence did not deepen. It stayed politely where it was. Somewhere, a spoon touched porcelain and was put down very quietly. Perdita made the small movement of the head which precedes a question when the question is not allowed. Her eyes found Lord Ivor and went away at once. Dame Celia's hand, which had been playing with the pearl at the top of her necklace, fell to the next pearl and stayed there. "She got out then," Sir Lionel said. "At Hyde Park Corner. Ladies have been known to do that for various reasons." "Her bag is in the car," Maddox added without looking at Perdita. "Her gloves are in the bag. There is a—" He glanced with a respect that reached beyond Lady Honoria to Luke. "There is a small smear of pollen, my lady, on the handle." "That will be from the lilies at her house," Lady Honoria said at once. "Verity is fond of lilies. No, consults them, as if they had opinions." "Miss Loxham," said Mr. Pardo, in the judicial tone he adopted when dealing with wills and with women, "is impulsive, not foolish. She would not leave her bag in a car in the West End." "She would if she meant to be dramatic," Maurice said. He smiled at Lady Honoria. "Let us accept it. There has been a small piece of private theatre." "I dislike theatre in private life," Lord Ivor said. He did not look at any of them. "Maddox, call Loxham House again." "I have, my lord," said Maddox, as if this had been anticipated by the original builder of the house and resolved then. "The line does not quite answer. Mr. Blythe's man says the exchange is occupied." "Occupied?" Mr. Pardo drew out his handkerchief and returned it as if correcting an error on a document. Telephone exchanges, Dame Celia murmured, have a way of disapproving of our difficulties. Lady Honoria's eyes rested on the muslin-draped portrait. "We will dine," she said. "We are, after all, in England, and not at the mercy of our feelings. Lord Ivor, will you take Dame Celia? Mr. Pardo, you will escort Madame Léonie. Yes, it will be charming, and she will be kind to you. Maurice, Perdita is pale and in need of an ally. Sir Lionel, you shall have me, and I shall have advice." The party moved with the mechanical grace of a figure on a clock. Frobisher, left for a moment alone with the portrait and his moderate boredom, lifted the muslin again, almost imperceptibly, and peered. He smiled, not with pleasure exactly, but with the pride that attends upon good work well concealed. Then he let the muslin fall and followed the others into the dining room. As the doors closed, the music, which had hovered, took a breath. Maddox, who had remained behind to look at things that did not require looking at, permitted himself a small adjustment of the muslin as if, by pressing it very slightly against the canvas below, he could impose upon the painted girl a little more decency. His eyes, which had seen many such evenings and watched the delicate machinery of them set going and stopped again, rested for one moment upon the smear of golden powder on the handle of a crocodile skin bag. Lying open on a chair by the door, he went away, leaving the muslin immaculate. In the dining room, candle flames captured the exact proportion of silver to glass and made a harmony of it that would have pleased a mathematician. The soup was perfect. Conversation made a sound like silk moved among cedar, and under it, under the fine linen, the claret, the trifling exchange of news and of little nothings, it seemed to Perdita that there was a second table, half an inch lower than their own, at which other words sat unsaid. Lady Honoria, speaking to Sir Lionel of entirely improper things, armies, budgets, bad theatre, had the curious impression that her room and her evening were like one of those careful arrangements of flowers that sit very still between two mirrors. They doubled and redoubled, and in each repetition there was the same fault. A petal, perhaps, not wishing to bloom. A leaf, perhaps, pretending it would not fall. She thought, with a civility that felt almost like prayer, that Verity Loxham had better come in at once. The house had the sound a grand house makes when a party has ebbed. Not silence, exactly, but a faint subsiding. A glass touching a tray, a whisper of skirts on the stairs, a door that closes with unnecessary gentleness. Sir Felix's man, Nash, moved through these diminuendos with his compact, almost ecclesiastical quiet, recovering from the evening the small tempers of the rooms and restoring them to their daytime propriety. The veiled portrait of Miss Cressida Harland remained above the chimney-piece in the great drawing-room, its pall of muslin hovering like a decorous rebuke. The guests had gone with the decent murmur that accompanies disappointment. Cressida had not appeared for her own unveiling. Mr. Julian Loder had not gone. He had asked, with that precise courtesy of his, for the use of the library telephone and a moment to compose a letter for Sir Felix's signature. "Routine, Sir Felix," he had said carefully. "In view of the girl's absence, we must do only what is consonant with good sense." Sir Felix, whose sense was good but not necessarily consonant with calm, had consented, and then, out of a consideration that came as naturally to him as command, had left Loder alone. Later, when the silver had been counted and the last fragment of pâté coaxed away from its leaf of lettuce, Nash carried a small tray into the library. The decanter and one glass, a dish of those indigestible little biscuits solicitors affect, and the sober napkin folded into a square. He set it on a side table and withdrew without disturbing the lawyer, who sat with his back to the room at the writing table, head bent, a lamp gathering a circle of light around the careful slope of his shoulders. In such a house, night is as managed as day. At 1 o'clock, Mrs. Monk had made her last survey and withdrawn. At past, the chauffeur's footsteps crossed the mews at the back and fell away. At 2, the Clocks agreed among themselves on the hour and shook it out into the sleeping rooms like a handful of coins, each piece of sound separate. And at a little after 7, Nash descended from his own narrow stairs to draw curtains and rebuke the grate for its ashes. He found the library door standing as it had stood when he had left it, not closed, but at that polite angle with the jamb which in such houses is almost a conversation. He pushed it wider and went in with his little cough that in daytime prefaced the announcement of visitors. "Mr. Loder, sir," he said softly. Mr. Loder did not move. The lamp, burned low, had the defeated look of any lamp that has done more than its shift. In the cold morning light, the room was faintly grey, the polished things grey. Even the leather looked asleep. Nash set his tray on the same side table and came up behind the writing chair. The lawyer's hand had fallen from the blotter to his knee. The other lay, loose-fingered, near the nib of a pen. There was a sheet of paper beneath the blotter, and the corner of it showed. On the arm of the chair, a square of sealing wax lay broken, as if it had split under a small, decisive pressure. "Mr. Loder," Nash said again. He did not touch him at once. A servant, properly trained, avoids the indecorum of uninvited contact, even with death. He bent closer, and the small hairs on his neck rose. There was no sound but the faint, adverse rattle of the street. Then he went out quickly and up the stairs to Sir Felix's room with steps that denied their haste by being noiseless. Sir Felix came down in his dressing gown and stood very straight in the doorway, taller than the morning. He looked and said unhelpfully, "Loder." It might have been a greeting in another circumstance. He went to the side table, set right the shade of the lamp with a touch that was almost affectionate, and then faced the chair. His cheeks, which were usually ruddy from outdoor habits, showed a sort of exact pallor. "Don't touch him. Ring Dr. Petworth." And he looked not at Nash, but at the drawer of the writing table, which stood a fraction open. "We shall have to ring the police." Lady Leonora Greville descended as far as the turn of the stairs and addressed them with that mixture of breeding and appetite for drama that is the female relations' prerogative. "Felix, what is it?" "Nash." She took a step down, saw the angle of the chair and the set of the two men's faces, and stopped. "Oh," she said on an outward breath. "Oh, Julian." She did not come any further. Miss Blanche Digby, the impoverished cousin engaged to keep Cressida in countenance, hovered and then withdrew in obedience to a look from Nash that was not unkind, but which brooked no entrée. The servants, with their science of calamity, began to arrange the house for grief. Curtains left but a notch, voices clasped at the throat, doors that closed themselves. Dr. Petworth arrived with his black bag and his careful face, and in the library made the motions that are expected of him. He glanced once at the decanter and the single glass, tasted neither, and frowned abstractedly at the small square of broken wax. "He has been dead some hours," he said to Sir Felix, and because they were both old men with a belief in economy, he did not say the rest. He looked at the sheet under the blotting pad, but did not move it. Sir Felix said, "He was writing." It was not a question. "Apparently." Dr. Petworth turned to the window. "We must inform the yard." The note of it lay in the room after he had gone upstairs to telephone from Sir Felix's study. In the desk drawer that stood subtly ajar, there were envelopes of various dignities, and upon the blotter the half-visible edge of Mr. Loder's last sentence, a word or two in that firm lawyer's hand. "In view of Miss Harland's," and then the pen trace that goes down at the end, like a line losing courage. They left the room as it was. Nash drew the door to its correct angle and stood a moment in the corridor, hands composed at his sides. Out of the great drawing-room, the veiled portrait made its quiet, unworldly claim on attention, the fall of muslin scarcely moving in the draught. The house smelt of extinguished lamp and lemon polish, and, under it, of cut white flowers. Somewhere, someone cried, and then, remembering themselves, ceased. The inquiry, Nash thought, would be long and conducted in low voices. He went away to see that there was hot water. Inspector Alleyn arrived with the quiet swiftness of a man used to being expected without being desired. The Belgravia house presented its stately face to the street. Polished brass, black paint, a fanlight of immaculate glass. Within, the hall paused in its own reflection. Mirrors, a faint scent of beeswax, the consolatory tick of the grandfather clock. The butler, whose mourning tie had been produced with a rapidity that suggested an organized mind, ushered him up the stairs with a discretion that stopped short of secrecy. Miss Cordelia Marsh stood near the landing window as if to fend off, with rigid propriety, the encroaching disorder. Alleyn greeted her as one greets a person of rank in their own element. His voice, without inappropriately lowering itself, found a note that smoothed the edges of the moment. "You have done everything necessary," he said. "Dr. Pemberton is already here?" "In the sitting room, sir," she replied, the steadiness of her voice striking him as an act of loyalty. "I took the liberty of closing the door." He inclined his head and, after a pause that might be mistaken for courtesy but was in fact attention, entered the room. The still life presented itself again. Pale blue silk, cream paper, the cool glint of the fountain pen. Dr. Pemberton straightened from his stoop and gave the inspector a look in which professional assurance and something more defensive made a neat coalition. "Natural causes are not out of the question," the doctor murmured too quickly. "A faint heart. These young ladies are not always quite so robust as they appear." Alleyn's glance moved from the doctor to the woman in the chair. He did not approach at once. The eye, unhurried, took a slow inventory. He noted the quality of the morning light, muted, forgiving. He noted that the sash of the window was closed and that the curtains had been redrawn after dusk and opened again by someone who did not fling them wide. A coal fire, last night's, lay collapsed in its grate with a respectful neatness. Vivian Ashford, he used the name in his mind with that slight detachment he reserved for those who could no longer answer to it, had the arranged look that death often borrows from life. The locket's chain, pale against the dress, had slipped its customary orbit. Where it usually lay there was a small oval of paler skin, an imprint of habit. Just below the left shoulder, where the dress curved in a gentle seam, the blue deepened by a shade. He did not lean closer. It would not do to reach for explanations as if they were falling objects. They must be allowed to settle. The letter, on heavy cream, had been begun in a hand that declared energy. The first lines were uncompromised. Thereafter, the sweep of the script faltered but did not trail. It ended at a full stop that seemed, under the circumstances, almost impertinent. There was no envelope. The blotting paper, when he turned it delicately with a gloved finger, yielded mirror impressions of the last sentence, the finality of the punctuation repeated, faintly embarrassed in pinkish ghostings. On the small table, the Sèvres cup had acquired its thin integument. Alleyn set a fingertip to the saucer, cold, and lifted the cup to his nose. No vivid betrayal of almond. A gentler fragrance, bergamot and something floral, reached him as from a drawer of remembered handkerchiefs. The rim showed a pale crescent. No heavy lipstick. Either she had not dressed for the street last night, or she had bathed and rearranged herself later. He placed the cup back in precisely its original arc. He looked for the second cup that too often tells its own story, and found none. The tray for breakfast chocolate he found, presently, downstairs in the morning room, prim and intact, the chocolate cooling on its silver stand like an idea that had not been taken up. He made, returning, a small acknowledgment to Miss Marsh, as if to say that he had seen, and would not comment. "Miss Marsh," he said in the doorway, and again the voice found the correct weight. "How long would Miss Ashford usually sit at her desk in the evening?" "She preferred to write in the mornings," came the answer, promptly but without eagerness. Evenings were for music or if she was quiet. Reading. Last night she did not go out. Quite, Alleyn said, as if confirming a private thought, and left it there. He went once more about the room without touching anything. He noted a trace, minute, on the edge of the writing blotter, where the gold pen's nib had rested and dried. He observed, in the ash tray, the pale dust of a single spent match and the absence of any accompanying cigarette. In the little waste-paper basket, an austerity, one narrow strip of torn paper, no larger than the nail of a thumb, showing only the crossed tail of a capital letter. It might have been the remains of a list. It might have been nothing. Dr. Pemberton, who had been watching with the faint impatience of a man who expects to be asked a question and has already composed his reply, cleared his throat. "You will wish to make arrangements," he said stiffly. "I should recommend—" "Forgive me," Alleyn said very gently, "but we shall make as few arrangements as possible until we are obliged to. Would you be so good as to remain available? I'm afraid we shall ask you presently to be precise in a world not built for precision." The doctor looked as if he had been made to swallow a pill he himself had not prescribed, and bowed. "Superintendent Fox," Alleyn said, when his colleague's solid bulk appeared on the threshold. "We'll keep the household together downstairs. No dramatics. There is nothing here to excite the imagination. Let us keep it so. The staff to the morning room, the family, such as they are, to the drawing room. We shall not yet interfere with Miss Ashford." Fox's small eyes took in the scene without comment. "Very good, sir." Alleyn allowed himself one last look at the young woman in the chair. He thought, not without an unwelcome tenderness, of the 3 men who had waited the previous night, and of the precise fervour with which Miss Marsh had kept the house ticking. Somewhere in this symmetry a hand had made a minute flaw, and it was the flaw that would tell him the pattern. He smoothed his glove as if to iron a wrinkle out of thought, and turned to the corridor's cool air. "Miss Marsh," he said, almost conversationally as they moved away from the door, "you will help us with the small things. They are very often the only things." Her hands, folded with care, tightened on each other by a fraction. "Yes, Inspector, I dare say they are." Alleyn preferred to begin with the unadorned facts of habit and hour. In the morning room, a place of polished mahogany and pale walls where conversation was accustomed to travel only so far as good manners allowed, he invited Miss Marsh to sit. She obeyed with the composure of someone for whom obedience had long since become a profession, and folded her capable hands as if they might otherwise betray her. "You discovered Miss Ashford at what time?" he asked. "Shortly after 8, Miss Marsh replied. "I had brought up her chocolate at 8 precisely. It was then I noticed, well, that she had not opened the post, and that the room was closed. I became uneasy. She had retired early. Not early, precisely. She was to attend Mr. Fortescue's opening at 7. She sent word through me that she would not go. A headache. She had seemed unsettled, Inspector, which you did not think unusual." "Vivian could be animated," Miss Marsh said carefully. "She had the gift of energy, but last night the animation was of a different sort. It seemed applied rather than natural." "Applied," Alleyn repeated, as if testing the word. "Did she dine?" "In her sitting room. I sent up a tray at 7:15. Tea and a little salad. She sent the tray back nearly untouched. And after that, I did not disturb her again. I had no reason to think—" "No," said Alleyn gently. "No reason at all?" He allowed silence to rest between them, and then, with a delicacy that had nothing of tentativeness, said, "You mentioned that Miss Ashford intended a public announcement at the gallery?" "Yes," Miss Marsh answered, looking beyond him to the ordered brightness of the street. "She meant to confirm her engagement." "To whom?" Miss Marsh's pause was barely perceptible and wholly eloquent. She had not finally decided how that confirmation should be phrased. "3 gentlemen?" Alleyn suggested, more as a kindness than a question. "Mr. Julian Fortescue, Captain Harbury, and Mr. Owen Vale." The names were presented like items on an inventory. Mr. Fortescue owns the gallery. Captain Harbury is lately of the Air Ministry. Mr. Vale is a lecturer in classics at King's. Each was aware, more or less, of the possibility. And your own view? I am not constituted to have views of that sort, she said with the faintest smile, a rigid line that trembled and steadied itself. But I observed. Alleyn did not press. He thanked her and asked that the three gentlemen be sent word with discretion that their attendance might be required later in the day. Miss Marsh inclined her head and withdrew, leaving the imprint of reserve in the room. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, followed, a stout woman with an air of order about her, as if the very folds of her apron had been persuaded into obedience. You superintend the service on the second floor, Mrs. Hartwell. I do, sir. The still room prepares the tea and trays. Elsie, the under-housemaid, takes them up. I look in, usually before retiring. About 10, past. Last night Miss Vivian had asked not to be disturbed. The Sèvres cup in Miss Ashford's sitting room, Alleyn said mildly. Is it the usual choice for upstairs service? Mrs. Hartwell's hands, which had been safely clasped, shifted and reclasped. Not usually, sir, but Miss Vivian sometimes preferred it. She was particular about certain things. Quite. Alleyn waited. Particular, yesterday evening. I couldn't say. She stared just past his shoulder. The upstairs tea was laid earlier than usual, owing to the gallery engagement. When Miss Vivian decided against going, the tray was already prepared. And the chocolate in the morning? I take that up myself, Mrs. Hartwell said, with dignity. Miss Marsh sent me down again. Afterwards. Thank you. He let her go with a nod that was almost courtly. She retreated with a relief that, in another house, might have been relief at a finished task. Here, it looked more like relief at having revealed nothing at all. Greaves, the butler, came in with a measured tread that suggested polished floors had shaped his very gait. He had the grave, expressionless competence of the very good butler, and the faint, omniscient sadness that attaches to men who observe more than they are allowed to remark upon. Greaves, Alleyn said, you admit callers? I do, sir. Yesterday. A bouquet from Captain Harbury in the afternoon. White freesias, a note attached, undistinguished in its contents. Greaves's inflection made the word undistinguished a protective veil. Mr. Fortescue sent round proofs in a card. Mr. Vale telephoned at 6:30. I informed him that Miss Ashford was not at home. Did he leave a message? That he would write, Greaves said. He produced a small array of cards, each handled as if it were of moderate but definite value. There were also inquiries from Lady Ashmore. At Alleyn's glance, Captain Harbury's aunt, sir. The telephone, Alleyn said, turning the word as if it were a trinket. Was there any other call? Later? Greaves's eyelids lowered and lifted. Not after dinner, sir. Very good. You will have the kindness to remain available. When Greaves had bowed himself out, Alleyn stood for a moment at the window. The street's propriety went on, taxis nosing past like careful cattle. In his mind, he set the small facts in a line as a child sets pebbles. A postponed announcement. A particular cup, the letter halted in mid-impulse. 3 men whose claims were at once advances and obligations. He returned upstairs and, with Dr. Pemberton's leave, examined the writing table again. The letter he did not yet read. But he noted the blotter's second sheet, its faint, ghostly impress of words that had not intended to be witnessed. He closed the desk with a touch that was almost affectionate and thought, as he had thought in many rooms where elegance had edged itself against calamity, that the truth in such houses seldom arrived with noise. He would see the servants again, privately. For the moment, he asked for tea and a quiet room in which to await the gentlemen who, summoned by discretion and dread, would begin to arrive. Mr. Jessup, the butler, entered with the measured dignity of a man who comprehended the moral authority of silver and had spent his life in its service. He was tall, delicately stooped, his expression one of equable sorrow that stopped well short of familiarity. "Mr. Jessup," Alleyn said, as if they were to discuss the placement of candles, "I want to trouble you as little as possible. Yesterday evening—" "Quiet, sir." The word fell with impeccable restraint. "Miss Ashford dined in her rooms. Miss Marsh took a tray up at 7:30. I remained below. There were no callers." "No callers at all?" Alleyn let his eyebrows express the mildest incredulity. "In Belgravia." Jessup's mouth permitted a fraction of humor that vanished before it quite came. "There was a note, sir. Hand-delivered about 9. A boy." Miss Marsh asked that it be taken up at once. "By whom?" Jessup's gaze moved a fractional degree to the left and back again. "I took it myself, sir." "Did you see Miss Ashford?" "No, sir. I put it on the small table in her sitting room. Miss Marsh was with her. I withdrew." "The boy?" "A runner from Fortescue's, I believe." The answer came with the tentative air of a fact that had not been entirely authorized. "Believed by whom?" "By the hall boy," Jessup said. "He thought he recognized the livery. Mr. Fortescue's people deliver catalogues." Alleyn let the thread lie lightly across his fingers. "And after that?" "Nothing further, sir. I shut up the house at 11, locks and bolts. The tradesman's gate was secured at dusk. The night bell did not ring." He gave the butler a look of gratitude that might have been meant for a rescue performed under fire. "Thank you. Mrs. Hartwell." The housekeeper presented herself with the firm quiet of a woman who knew where the linen was kept and who had put the fear of God into at least 3 generations of housemaids. She took the edge of the chair as if she were unlikely to occupy it long. "Mrs. Hartwell," Alleyn said, "the morning arrangements." "Miss Ashford was to have chocolate at 8, sir," she said, hands folded on her lap. "The parlour maid sets the tray. Miss Marsh takes it up. That is our custom. It was done this morning." "And the tea upstairs?" Mrs. Hartwell's expression did not alter. "Tea, sir." "In Miss Ashford's sitting room, Sèvres cup. Painted roses." A chord sounded in the silence, so light one might almost have imagined it. If Mrs. Hartwell was surprised, she had rehearsed for such a moment all her life. "I cannot say, sir. Miss Ashford's porcelain is kept in the dining-room cabinet. It is accounted for before and after use." "And this morning?" "I have not yet done the count," said Mrs. Hartwell. "I thought it proper to await your instructions." A careful truth that kept company with something withheld. "Who holds the cabinet key?" "Mr. Jessup, sir, and myself. When entertaining, we share the duty." Alleyn nodded, as if that satisfied an abstract curiosity. "The parlour maid?" "Lily, sir." She arrived, a pale girl with neat hands and a lid of composure pulled down over some private agitation. Alleyn spoke to her as if requesting the time. "You laid the morning tray?" "Yes, sir." "Chocolate?" "Yes, sir." "Did you take tea to Miss Ashford last night, or this morning?" "No, sir." She said it too quickly and then corrected herself, flushing. "No, sir. I did not take tea." "Has Miss Ashford lately altered her habits?" "Not as I know, sir." "Did you see the hand-delivered note?" "A boy came," Lily admitted. "He had a cap. He said it was for Miss Ashford for immediate. Mr. Jessup took it." She swallowed. "I saw the envelope after." "After what?" "After Miss Marsh put it in the little silver rack on Miss Ashford's desk." She blurted this and then bit her lip, as if recognizing she had gone a hair's breadth too far. "Thank you," Alleyn said, and stood, releasing her like a bird. "Wicks?" The chauffeur, a compact man with immaculate boots, contributed little beyond the negative. The car had not been ordered after 6. He knew nothing of notes or cups. Captain Dacre's groom had telephoned in the afternoon, cheerfully inquiring if Miss Ashford would be riding at Richmond later in the week. He had passed the message on. He did not think the call of consequence. Alleyn let the phone call drift into a small backwater of his mind. He returned at last to Jessup. "The Sèvres," he said, as if they had been discussing that all along. "May I see the cabinet?" They went together to the dining room where glass reflected the morning with a kind of dignified melancholy. Inside, the porcelain glowed. One place in the front row, painted roses, had been filled with a matching cup, a fraction off its angle. It was the sort of discrepancy only a man like Jessup would notice. Alleyn waited. Jessup did notice. He did not speak of it. "Beautiful things," Alleyn observed. "Slightly tyrannical, don't you find?" Jessup made a soft noise that might have passed for assent. "It's an oddity," Alleyn said, with the gentle wonder of a man turning a shell in his hand. "Chocolate unattended, tea attended, a cup in the wrong bed, a note that might or might not have come from a gallery. Nothing that anyone has done wrong, and yet—" He left the sentence where it broke, and looked, not at Jessup, but at the blank space in the cabinet where the tyranny of order had faltered and been restored. The house, he thought, was doing its best to resume its ritual, and in the act had confessed that ritual had been broken. "Thank you," he said, and dismissed them with a courtesy that eased their retreat. As the door closed, Alleyn remained at the sideboard, tracing the faint ghost marks where a tray had lately rested. Somewhere before midnight, a small courtesy had been extended and accepted. A cup carried where a cup should not be. The servants knew and had decided, with the tact of their profession, that tact might be safer than speech. He had no intention of forcing them. The house would yield itself, a layer at a time. The next would not be taken from the kitchen, but from the streets, a gallery, a runner in a cap, and a note whose immediacy had been judged greater than a headache. Alleyn returned to the sitting room with Miss Marsh at his side, the two of them moving with the measured gravity of people who know that haste is the enemy of accuracy. The morning light had sharpened slightly. It caught at the gilt threads in the carpet and at the delicate lattice work of the writing desk. Vivian's stillness had been replaced by Dr. Pemberton's carefully drawn sheet. Yet the room retained her presence. The faint powder scent, the suggestion of expectation suspended, as if the conversation she had been about to have might still be resumed. "Miss Marsh, may I trouble you about something very small?" Alleyn's tone was mild, almost conversational. "Miss Ashford's habits at tea." "Certainly, Inspector." "She drank tea at night?" "Rarely. If at all, a weak china after dinner, more often chocolate, and never after 6. Did she take milk? Lemon, if anything. Sugar only to oblige Aunt Honoria, who disapproved of austerities." Alleyn inclined his head toward the small table beside the chair. The Sèvres cup with painted roses sat on its saucer, immaculate and somehow accusatory. He lifted it with care, sniffed, then angled it slightly so that the light traced a thin opalescent film along its inner curve. "Milk," he said, not as a question. "Yes," Miss Marsh replied slowly. "That is extremely unusual." "More unusual than the choice of china." Miss Marsh's gaze moved to the cup, and her composure, though intact, took on a new quality, alert, inward. "We reserve the Sèvres for callers. When Miss Vivian is alone, we use the blue Wedgwood. She liked—" The sentence trailed off into a silence more eloquent than completion. "Thank you." He set the cup down exactly as he had found it. "And when the Sèvres is used for callers, it is used in pairs." "Naturally." They went down together to the dining room where the rose and gold service was kept in a glass-fronted cabinet as if the porcelain were themselves minor members of the family. Mrs. Hartwell was there already, as if summoned by the house's own instinct for order. She had a key. The door opened with the reluctant sigh of a well-made lock. Sarah noticed a misplacement. Alleyn said, "Yes, Inspector." Mrs. Hartwell's voice held the dry steadiness of a woman who has run a household like a regiment. "On the middle shelf." The left-hand cup and saucer were returned one place over. This morning they had been shifted back, though not to my liking. Alleyn looked closely. The cups and saucers formed an orderly architecture of fragile arches, the sort of arrangement that only someone with a passion for symmetry would devise and could detect when disturbed. On the shelf's inner edge, a pale crescent of dust had been disrupted. A single saucer bore a faint ring, not of tea, but of something granular that left the lightest chalk upon his fingertip. "Sugar," he said, more to the shelf than to the women. "Miss Vivian did not keep sugar here," Mrs. Hartwell replied. "It is stored in the pantry. For callers, we bring the tongs and the nips." "And last night?" Mrs. Hartwell folded her hands in the formal clasp of responsibility. No caller was announced. Alleyn accepted this with a nod and asked presently to see the servants' bellboard. In the hall outside the kitchen, the annunciator hung like a small theatre box. Its brass labels, front door, morning room, sitting room, dining room, side entrance, were engraved in an elegant hand that belonged to another age. Tiny flags behind glass recorded the bell's recent excitations. "Do you reset it each morning?" he asked Jessup, who had joined them with the gravity of a man attending his own character witness. "As a rule, sir, after 10. We have not today." 2 flags had been disturbed. The front door indicator sat crooked in its slot. 9 o'clock, Jessup said, consulting his watch as if the past could be checked against it. "The boy with the note." "The side entrance?" Alleyn asked. Jessup hesitated fractionally, a stitch pulled half tight. "It is temperamental, sir. It can be jostled by a draught." "Of course." Alleyn's courtesy was immaculate. "When did this particular draught arise?" "Sometime after 9. I was in the pantry. Mrs. Hartwell had retired to her rooms. I heard nothing." "Was any member of staff upstairs at that time?" "Miss Marsh, perhaps. Sarah, if needed. We keep a light step after 9. Alleyn let it pass. He stood a moment longer before the annunciator, watching the small glass rectangle as if it might volunteer a confidence. It did not. The house was loyal to itself. Back in the sitting room, he examined the writing things with a delicate thoroughness that is indistinguishable from tact. The fountain pen on the desk was heavy, gold-mounted, masculine in its proportions, with a broad nib that left a generous line. The letter, no more than a page, showed a hand that was assured, yes, but crossed occasionally by faint hesitations, little rivulets of thought diverted and resumed. "Miss Marsh," he said softly, "is this Miss Ashford's pen?" Miss Marsh glanced and shook her head. "Her pens are finer. She preferred a French nib, narrow, that is, was her father's, kept in the study. I brought it up last week at her request. She said her own had gone dry." "Did Miss Ashford habitually write here?" he asked. "In the mornings. In the evenings, she used the writing table in her bedroom. The light is better there. Last night she chose the sitting room." "Yes." He regarded the small, displaced world of the desk. The cup on its island of polished wood, the folded sheet of cream-laid paper with its watermark half visible in the angled light. The ritual had been elegant, a caller or the semblance of one. The formal china, the milk no one would have thought to provide unless they were thinking of themselves. The bell that had perhaps been rung by the garden gate, where household routine could be persuaded to avert its gaze. "Inspector," Miss Marsh's voice was very gentle. "Merely a house teaching me its habits," Alleyn said. "It is sometimes more eloquent than people." He took up the locket that had been placed with care upon a silver tray by Dr. Pemberton. The hinge was firm. Within, a miniature photograph of Colonel Ashford in uniform faced a curl of golden hair. He brought it close to the light. There, along the inside of the clasp, a faint smear of blue. Ink, perhaps, so fine as to be invisible unless one looked for it. He thought of the deeper blue beneath the left shoulder, the milk film, the sugar's ghost. He did not assemble them. Not yet. "I shall need to speak with Mr. Fortescue about his messenger," he said presently, "and to ask whether any caller was expected by arrangement rather than announcement." He replaced the locket with the precision of a man concluding a movement in a minuet. The house resumed its poised stillness. Somewhere a clock chimed the half-hour, civilized and implacable. "Thank you, Miss Marsh," Alleyn said. "If it is convenient, I shall call at the gallery before luncheon." He took his hat. In the hall, the Annunciator's little flags were steadfastly mute. Upstairs, the painted roses on the Sèvres cup smiled their small, knowing smile. By late afternoon, the house had settled into that peculiar hush which follows official visits and precedes the first whisperings of speculation. Footsteps softened. Doors, ordinarily frank in their comings and goings, contrived to close without sound. Alleyn, in Miss Marsh's morning room, stood by the long windows and watched the pale day thin itself along the mews. He had the impression, one he had learned to trust, that the case had paused only to draw breath. It was Miss Marsh who brought the new disturbance, though she carried it with her habitual decorum. In her gloved hand she bore an envelope of the house stationery, thin, creamy, watermarked, folded once with domestic exactness. She did not speak at once, and in the pause Alleyn knew the thing would prove important, less for what it was than for what it could not possibly be. "This was delivered a few minutes ago," she said. "By the same boy, I believe, who came last night." "For you?" Alleyn took the envelope without haste. The address, Miss Cordelia Marsh, had been written in a hand that, at a glance, made the heart lurch. It was Vivian's hand, the confident slope, the sovereign little hook to the V. Yet under the fair copy lay a something else, a caution that was not hers. "She never called me Cordelia in writing," Miss Marsh said quietly, "always Miss Marsh, and always dear without the my. And she dated from the upper right. This is dated below the salutation." "You have a very exact memory," Alleyn said. "It is my employment to have one." He opened the letter with as little damage to the fold as possible. The contents were brief. Miss Marsh was enjoined, for the sake of all that is decent, to deliver at once to the bearer the blue folder sealed C.A. from Colonel Ashford's papers. There was a reference to preventing harm and a final line, "After the household retires, the matter must be finished," followed by Vivian's name, written with a flourish she had never indulged. The paper, the ink, even the scent, faintly of heliotrope, were hers. The manner was not. "Have the Colonel's papers been touched?" Alleyn asked. Miss Marsh's composure tightened by a degree. "They are kept in the study safe. The key is in my possession. Miss Vivian asked to see certain items last week under my supervision. And the blue folder. There is one, marked with his initials. It has not left the safe since yesterday." Alleyn looked again at the handwriting. It was good imitation, very good. But even the best copyist betrays himself in the dull places. How a T is crossed when the thought is elsewhere, the pinch of pressure before a comma. He saw, too, the echo of last night's torn fragments. "After the household retires." "Would you be so good as to give me the boy," said Alleyn, "and not the folder?" The errand runner, when produced to the servants' hall, proved to be a wiry creature with a cap that had lost the argument with his ears and an expression of careful blandness. Alleyn's manner with such persons had the warmth of a kindly uncle combined with the memory of a hanging judge. "Who gave you the letter?" "A gent round Shepherd Market," the boy replied with the promptness of someone who preferred the truth when it cost nothing. "Said there'd be a packet, blue, and I was to wait for it and take it back. £half a crown now, 2 bob after." "Describe the gentleman." The boy tilted his head. "Hat down, gloves, smelt nice." "Nice how?" "Like them little bottles in the window, violets or what all." Mrs. Hartwell, hovering in the doorway, received a glance from Alleyn that contained a request and an instruction. "Mr. Jessup," she said, "would you be good enough to fetch the small blue folder?" A few minutes later, Jessup returned with a folder of exactly the proper weight and color, its contents, blank notepaper, selected to be as unprovoking as possible. The seal, a neat CA in blue wax, had been impressed by Jessup's seal from an old household ribbon box. It would, Alleyn thought, serve. "Now," he said to the boy, "take this back to your gentleman and go the way you came." The boy vanished with the swift decorum of his class. Alleyn, retrieving his hat and a light overcoat he wore as a species of uniform against inquisitive eyes, moved to the door. In the hall, he encountered a familiar solidity in a dark suit, discreetly trimming the edges of the household. Inspector Fox had arrived, a comfortable presence, and took the situation in with his usual economy of gesture. "A quiet walk," Alleyn murmured. "You won't mind watching the back, Fox?" In the fading light, they let the errand run as it had been laid. The boy angled through the little streets, dodged a cart, and paused obediently at Shepherd Market. The man was there, as such men are, already a part of the scenery when one first looks properly at it. He was of middle height, the cut of his coat a fraction better than the surroundings demanded. His gloves retained their shape even in idleness. He let the boy come to him rather than stepping forward, took the packet without haste, and moved at once. No glance, no pause, toward the mews where a taxi, its engine already contentedly ticking, was waiting. There was no chase. Alleyn had learned that certain moments are best conserved intact. He saw enough. The gloved hand, the dark oval of a signet against leather, the faint lift of the chin that spoke of self-possession practiced long. The cab pulled away into the pale street. Fox, who had taken a parallel line along the opposite pavement, rejoined him by a butcher's shop whose windows had been wiped to a metallic polish. "Number?" Alleyn asked. "Part only," Fox said. 7, 9. Couldn't see the rest for the mud." "We have the boy," Alleyn observed. "And the boy has an employer who pays on the nail. We mustn't be ungrateful." They returned to Belgravia by an unassuming route, entering the house without the least suggestion of triumph. The blue folder's absence, even in its counterfeit form, had disturbed the air. Miss Marsh received the news with a nod that accepted both the necessity and the danger. "You will keep the safe locked?" "At all times, Inspector." "And, Miss Marsh, if any further communication arrives, purporting to be from Miss Ashford, would you be good enough to allow me the little pleasure of opening it?" "Of course." It was as Alleyn replaced his hat on the hall table that he noticed another small displacement. The delicate silver locket, Vivian's locket, had been sent down earlier and was to have been placed in the study for safekeeping. Now it lay on the salver by the telephone, the chain coiled with an unfamiliar neatness. He lifted it and, for a moment, the faintest scent of heliotrope accompanied the movement, like the ghost of a gesture. "Who placed this here?" he asked. There was a brief silence in which the house listened to itself. "I did," said Jessup at last. "It was found, sir, on the back stairs. Mrs. Hartwell thought it best to bring it down." "On the back stairs," Alleyn repeated, and set the locket carefully back upon the salver as if returning a witness to its seat. "Thank you. I think we are ready for a little darkness." Night, which blesses some houses and betrays others, began to settle. The case had shifted by a degree hardly visible, yet decisive. Somewhere between the morning's proprieties and the evening's reservations, a new hand had reached into the Ashford household, deft, practiced, and afraid. After Jessup withdrew with the morning correspondence and Miss Marsh, with a small correct inclination of the head, returned to her domain of lists and keys, Alleyn remained in the study. The room had that hushed tenacity peculiar to places long accustomed to command. Even the dust motes, turning in the slant of autumn light, seemed to maintain formation. He stood by the colonel's desk not to ransack it. Miss Marsh had done enough of that in conscience, but to let the room resume its voice. On the surface lay those chastely arranged objects that had survived both service and retirement. An ivory paper knife, a heavy glass inkwell that reflected the window like a still pool, a pen rest with the faint shine of habitual touch. He imagined the absent file, a negative space as eloquent as any letter, and saw, rather than remembered, how Miss Marsh's hand had hovered over the emptiness as if reluctant to accuse the air. There was, he thought, a triad at the heart of the matter. Money, honor, love. Each had a different weight. A scandal touching regimental funds was a stone dropped into a closed well. The sound would carry downwards first, bruising those who had built their lives upon the well's unspoken depth. Money made quiet, practical demands. Honor insisted upon more dangerous settlements. Love, in its way, asked for both. He let his mind return to Vivian's sitting room. The father's pen, CA, chosen on that last evening. Not a sentimental whim only, a daughter laying claim to a borrowed authority, or rehearsing a signature that was not hers to write. The splintered letter, arrangements, truth tonight, carried the voice of a man who pressed rather than pleaded. The displaced Sèvres, restored with clumsy reverence. The small blue blemish on pale silk. Not the obvious stain of panic, but the delicate mark of civility out of place. Someone had insisted upon form. He thought of the suitors whose faces presented themselves like portraits hung in a corridor. Whitmore, compact and correct, whose instincts ran to smooth solutions achieved with a banker's tact. Thornfield, with his soldier's steadiness and a vocabulary of duty that made personal feeling obedient even when it smoldered. Ashworth, whose sensitivity might incline him to gestures for their beauty rather than their consequence. None sat comfortably with extortion, yet each, under the pressure of that triad, might have taken a step sideways. The staff, too, had their grammar. Jessop's pause had been brief but articulate. Hartwell's perfection admitted nothing by design and therefore confessed, by the smallest scuff, more than any nervous chatter could have betrayed. Sarah, little more than a shadow in her own world, had supplied the one bright thread of misplacement. That thread, tugged gently, might show who had returned to the cabinet in ignorance of its precise map. Dr. Pemberton, Alleyn said when the telephone brought the quiet burr of the local exchange. You'll forgive a question before the coroner is formally engaged. He listened. The doctor's prudent voice moved through routine. An apparently peaceful passing, no violence, nothing to insist upon a single brutal name for the thing that had occurred. There would be a post-mortem. Substances, if any, were patient. They could be coaxed to disclose themselves in due order. Quite, said Alleyn, and no need to alarm the household with conjecture. He replaced the receiver, hearing again Miss Marsh's controlled whisper at the missing file, the measured obscenity of the executor's letter. He rang again, this time for Fox at the yard, whose companionship in such matters was almost a private ritual. We've a hand-delivered letter in a heavy hand, he said, offering the bland information of a man discussing weather. If you could have someone, no fuss, keep an eye to Fortescue's, to the street lads who run messages there and to Ashford House itself. We're not snaring a boy, Brr Fox, only the hand that tosses him a coin. Fox's comfortable assent came like a nod over a club table. Alleyn asked also, in that same tone of domesticity, for a discreet opinion on the script, no formalities, no names, simply a sense of habits. The way a hand leans upon a downstroke when it is accustomed to authority, the impatience of a man who signs too many orders. He went out through the conservatory to the garden, an orderly square of gravel paths, and clipped yew. A robin, absurdly formal in its waistcoat, examined him and decided he was harmless. The grass bore no trace that would satisfy a constable's notebook, but the air retained the odor of damp earth and privet, and, fainter, the ghost of tobacco that had wandered out from the study for years and refused to abandon its post. He pictured Vivian here, at hours when the house believed itself asleep, walking the measured paths with that letter's words lodged like a stone against her heart. A girl reared to politeness, to treat each encounter, visitor, suitor, supplicant, with the currency of tea and voices low. If she had consented to a late caller, it would have been in this same spirit of order, the good china, the pen chosen as if to summon her. Father's steadiness, the careful returning of objects to their places when the world itself had begun to shift. In the space between these gestures, Alleyn felt the outline of a person distinct from the blunt shape of a blackmailer. Someone who knew the doorbell would not be answered after a certain hour, who could pass, perhaps, by a side entrance, who would understand which light would be visible from the street and which stay extinguished. All this knowledge was native to the house, or acquired from intimacy with those who governed it. He did not write any of this down. He let it settle, like that fine dust turning in the study, and waited to see what edges emerged when the air became still. He would, he decided, pay his respects at Fortescue's that afternoon and allow the gallery's habit of discretion to betray its recent traffic. He would ask Miss Marsh, at a moment when her hands were occupied with keys and could not perform, to tell him who among living men could have made the dead colonel's name do work after midnight. And he would return, before dusk, to stand once more in Vivian Ashford's quiet room and listen for the small sound a lie makes when it has been set carefully among true things. Beyond the clipped yews, a cab moved along the square with the ceremonious progress of a hearse. Inside the house, a bell sounded, luncheon, and the day reclaimed its routine with an admirable, almost touching propriety. Alleyn turned back to it, carrying with him the sense that the case had begun to disclose its shape, and that, like all true shapes in such houses, it was formed not by violence but by habit. By late afternoon, the house had settled into that curious composure that follows a day's disquiet. Alleyn asked that the principals assemble in the morning room to spare Miss Marsh the burden of many small decisions. The phrasing was gentle, almost apologetic. Miss Marsh, pale but orderly, took her customary place at a side table. Mr. Whitmore arrived with a gravity that verged upon ceremonial. Captain Thornfield entered with the contained energy of a man who has learned to walk softly without ever quite relaxing. Mr. Ashworth came last, his sensitive face drawn, his manner fluttering with the embarrassment of grief that can find no useful employment. At Alleyn's quiet request, Mrs. Hartwell had laid tea with a Sevres service. The painted roses, absurdly vivid under the flat London light, conferred upon the gathering a fragile domesticity, like flowers in a sick room. Jessup, performing his office with muted perfection, poured. Alleyn, who had arranged matters with the exactness of a rehearsal, accepted his cup and allowed conversation to move across the shallow channels propriety permits. "I have received," he said at last, producing the morning's heavy envelope, "a letter addressed to the executors. It concerns Colonel Ashford's Eastern investments." He did not look at anyone's face as he spoke. The pause afterward did its own work. The writer proposes a discreet settlement in lieu of a military inquiry. A Mr. Stoneman is named in the Colonel's correspondence. Do any of you know the name? Whitmore's gaze deepened as if consulting inward ledgers. "I've heard it in city talk. A speculative man, unencumbered by scruple." Thornfield's reply came without inflection. Stoneman operated in Rangoon and Kandy. His reputation was uncertain. The Colonel would have known it. Ashworth shook his head with the defenseless honesty of the unworldly. "The name is new to me, Inspector." Alleyn inclined his head slightly, as if all three answers were anticipated and of equal value. He set his cup down, not quite where the saucer invited it, and looked mildly apologetic. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm about to be troublesome. Would you indulge me by returning this cup to its accustomed place? I'm told the Sevres has a decided geography." Mrs. Hartwell rose, composed as ever. "Of course, sir." If our friends will forgive a domestic excursion, Alleyn continued pleasantly, it will relieve me of a curiosity. I've always admired the grammar of a well-kept house. He led them to the dining room with the air of a man innocently interested in placement. The glass-fronted cabinet waited in rectitude. Mrs. Hartwell opened it, revealing ranks of porcelain marshaled like a little army on parade. She reached for the vacant niche, a space on the upper shelf, third position from the left. Whitmore, perhaps from long acquaintance with ordered things, leaned a fraction forward, then checked himself. Thornfield stood at parade rest, expressionlessly attentive. Ashworth admired the glaze with the unembarrassed absorption of an aesthete. Mrs. Hartwell returned the cup. There was no comment. Alleyn's continued awkwardness was very gently theatrical. "Forgive me. Have I displaced something else by my interference?" "Not at all, sir," Mrs. Hartwell said. "It sits now as it should." "Thank you." His eye, in its turn, found Jessop's, and the butler, with the faintest inclination of the head, seemed to acknowledge a communication understood but not spoken. The little procession returned to the morning room with the solemnity of people who have witnessed an inconsequential ceremony and are not certain whether significance has been intended. When they were seated again, Alleyn allowed one of those small silences that civilized rooms can contain without embarrassment. He then relieved it with courtesy. "I have no wish to prolong matters today. There will be formalities, the coroner, certain statements. I am grateful for your patience." He rose. "Mr. Whitmore, Captain Thornfield, Mr. Ashworth." "Thank you. If you would be so good as to make yourselves available tomorrow morning, I shall trouble you further then." They took their leave with proper words. The door closed. Miss Marsh, who had not once permitted herself to intrude, looked at Alleyn with the anxious composure of a woman accustomed to being useful. "If you please," he said very gently, "I should like a word with Mr. Jessop." The butler appeared almost at once, as if the request had been anticipated. In the now quiet room, his presence seemed to restore to the house its unruffled surface. Alleyn remained standing. "Mr. Jessop," he began, "I am in need of your professional candor. It is not my purpose to compromise the household, still less to expose those who have acted from motives of protection. But I must know who came to this house on the night Miss Ashford died." Jessop's eyes lowered. When he spoke, his voice had the grave timbre of a man who has kept a difficult trust and sees the moment approaching when it must be surrendered. "Miss Vivian informed me in the afternoon that she expected a caller after the household retired, Inspector. She desired that the garden door be unbolted at 10:15. "And you complied?" "I did, sir." "Did you admit the caller?" "I met him in the passage and conducted him by the garden way to the small sitting room. I then withdrew." "How long did he remain?" "Until 11:15. Alleyn's pause was scarcely perceptible. Was the caller unknown to the house? Jessop's hands, folded perfectly upon themselves, tightened by the smallest degree. "No, sir. Was he one of the 3 gentlemen who attended today?" Jessop did not answer the question in words. He looked, for an instant only, at the military cap hanging upon a chair back, Colonel Ashford's relic from a former life, and then away again. The gesture was so slight it might have been accidental. It was not. "Very well," Alleyn said, as if a point of no particular consequence had been settled. "One more question. When you returned to secure the doors for the night, did you observe anything in the dining room?" Jessop's reply came without hesitation. "A cup and saucer from the Savour's service sat upon the sideboard, sir. I restored them to the cabinet as best I could." "As best you could," Alleyn repeated, and permitted himself the smallest inclination of thanks. "You have been of service." When Jessop had withdrawn, Miss Marsh said in a low voice, "Inspector, must there be a scene?" "No," Alleyn answered, "I think not." He stood for a moment in the window's pale light, considering the garden paths where evening had already begun to collect. The shape of the thing had settled not into drama, but into inevitability. Tomorrow would ask only for the quiet accuracy of naming. For tonight it was enough to know which door had opened and for whom. Alleyn asked Miss Marsh to step with him into the Colonel's study. It was the hour that best suited sober conversation. The light, thinning to silver at the edges, rendered objects exact without being cruel. She stood by the globe that had recorded, in faded inks, the old campaigns. He took the chair by the desk and rested a forefinger upon the leather blotter, as if counting time to a music that neither of them acknowledged. "Miss Marsh," he said, "we shall be quiet, if you please. There is no need to rehearse the dreadful list. You have been admirable in your care. It is only that certain details now point with a clarity we can no longer ignore." Her hands, capable, reserved hands, remained folded. "I'm listening, Inspector." "It was you who brought the Sèvres up," he said, as if remarking upon weather. "You chose the formality because it steadied Miss Vivian. It made the interview a ritual rather than a dispute. In replacing the cup, you made a small miscalculation. Mrs. Hartwell's arrangements are military. One hardly blames you for failing to reproduce them." Her gaze did not flicker. "Go on." "You carried the cup. One sees it, in careful fingers. A drop fell. That faint blue impression below the left shoulder of her gown. An odd, almost heraldic sign. You attempted to mend what could, in truth, no longer be mended." He glanced not unkindly at the tall cabinet that kept its own counsel. "There is more. The Colonel's desk. You hold the keys. The file marked Stoneman was there 3 days ago and gone yesterday. It was not Stoneman who removed it. It was you." She breathed once, as if the room had grown colder. "Yes," she said. It was almost a relief. "You knew of the blackmail," Alleyn continued. "You had watched Miss Ashford wrestle with it, and you understood, better than any of us, that she would go to the meeting demanded of her, at any cost. You believed you were saving her from the humiliation of bargaining with a blackmailer, from the possibility of scandal that might outlive her. You made tea. You added something to it. Not violent, not theatrical, nothing that would disfigure the scene. Veronal, perhaps. A quiet slip into quietness." Miss Marsh closed her eyes, not in protest, but in acknowledgement. "Only a little," she said, and her voice, for the first time, betrayed a tremor. "Enough to induce rest. She had not slept. She would not be moved. I thought, if I could place between her and that wretched appointment a barrier of sleep, we might find another course in the morning." "It is what one might have hoped," Alleyn said, and there was no irony in it. "But dosing is a cruel art. A second cup, perhaps. Anxiety that it had not taken effect. The household asleep. Your own sense that you must be sure." "I misjudged," she said. The words were without adornment. "I watched her begin to drowse. She spoke once, quite clearly. 'Tomorrow I shall do it differently.' She smiled. When her head drooped, I thought only that I had gained us time." The careful hands unfolded and clasped again. "In the morning, when I found her sitting so, and knew," she stopped. "I put the cup away. I changed it for the common set. I could not bear that the painted roses should witness it." Alleyn allowed the silence to settle. It did not accuse. It described. "You tore his letter," he said after a time, indicating with a small tilt of the head the reconstructed fragments upon the blotter. "And you took the Colonel's file." "I burned what would burn," she said. "I meant to protect his name. He was not a thief. He was imprudent, generous, credulous. Those ventures took more than they returned. He borrowed from the fund and meant to repay. It does not excuse it. It explains. I have written to the bank." She glanced at the window where dusk had begun its quiet occupation. "I have, these last days, tried to arrange what could be arranged." "And yet Mr. Stoneman writes to the executors," Alleyn observed. "He believes he still holds evidence." "He will hold some copy," Miss Marsh said. Men of that sort always do. I could not fight him in his own fashion. I could only— She did not finish the sentence. It completed itself in the room's attentive stillness. Miss Marsh, Alleyn said, you were with the family from the first. He had no need of the answer. It shaped itself upon her face. I came when Miss Vivian was 7. Her mother had already gone. The Colonel said to me, you will see her through. He was not a sentimental man. Only that, you will see her through. It was, Alleyn thought, the whole case in 5 words. He rose. I must do what is required of me, he said, but we shall do it properly. There will be no indignity. You will come with me presently and make a statement. I shall ask for a medical analysis. You understand that is inevitable. Before we leave, there are small matters you may wish to set in order. Her gratitude did not reach her mouth. It hovered somewhere about her eyes. I'm obliged to you, Inspector. One other thing, he added, and it was not a question. You did not intend to kill her? No. It was as if she offered the word to someone beyond them both. I intended to buy her a night. It cost her all her mornings. She turned, and her gaze rested with precise tenderness upon the chair by the window where Vivian had sat. I had thought, in my vanity, that I could keep the old promise. But one cannot see a child through the world, only to the edge of it. Alleyn inclined his head, as one bows in a chapel before leaving. He signaled for Jessup, who came with the tact of a man accustomed to approaching thresholds. Mr. Jessup, Alleyn said, Miss Marsh will require her coat and perhaps a letter or two. I shall wait in the morning room. The butler's old soldier's eyes took in what was required, and no more. Very good, sir. When Alleyn stepped back into the corridor, evening had settled over the house with that particular gravity that follows confession. He paused at the landing window and watched the garden paths darken into their own hieroglyphs. Somewhere, at the far edge of the matter, a man named Stoneman still held paper and intention. There would be a reckoning of another sort before the case could be safely closed. But for the present, the principal truth had been named, and it had not been shouted. It had arrived as such truths do, in a voice shaped by duty and fatigue, speaking not of hatred, but of miscalculation and love's dangerous economy. He went down slowly, to wait. The formalities proceeded with a tact that was almost ceremonial. Thornfield, having dressed with soldierly neatness, accompanied Alleyn to the yard without incident. No manacles, no need. The charge, when it came, was phrased with the economy of a profession that recognizes despair when it wears a rigid face. A solicitor, recommended by Whitmore with a phone call, whose brevity suggested both efficiency and a desire to absolve himself of further moral entanglement, presented himself within the hour. Alleyn, whose responsibilities now included the unglamorous procession of documents and signatures, found himself thinking not of courts and arguments, but of a small cup imperfectly returned to its place, and of a garden path that had offered a young woman the illusion of control when control had already slipped from her grasp. He returned to Belgravia in the late afternoon. Miss Marsh awaited him in the morning room, her composure thinner now, as if the skin that contained her formidable capabilities had been abraded by the last days. A letter lay upon the table, Thornfield's hand, military and spare. He has asked that I accept no explanations, she said, offering it to Alleyn. But explanations never were my part, only arrangements. The letter was brief. Miss Marsh, you will not, I trust, forgive me. I acted in the name of what I believed to be duty. It appears I mistook pride for it. Take care of the household a little longer. Burn every draft of Colonel Ashford's surviving letters. There is nothing to be saved now but the manner of our going on. M.T. Miss Marsh folded the paper with the precision of habit. I imagine there will be a hearing. There will, Alleyn said. It will be quiet. Such things usually are, when they touch certain regimental histories. Facts will be acknowledged with brevity, Circumstances will be permitted to speak for themselves. And Mr. Stoneman? It was Jessup who spoke from the doorway, a rare trespass upon the domain of conversation. If the file is gone, will his letters still bite? Less deeply, Alleyn said. He will be invited to bring his material to us. He may discover the law's curiosity extends to the methods by which he acquired it. Men of his species dislike scrutiny. They prefer doors that open only one way. It proved so. A civil note composed by Alleyn and signed by the executors offered an appointment at the yard to receive whatever documents Mr. Stoneman judged relevant to his threatened exposure. The reply did not come. A fortnight later, a bank diverted a transfer intended for him. An address in St. John's Wood was found vacant. A single trunk sent abroad failed to be claimed at a forwarding office in Lisbon. There are climates, Alleyn reflected, where certain reputations thrive better than in London fog. The servants adjusted themselves to the altered house with the instinct of those who live by measured days. Mrs. Hartwell moved through her lists with a new gravity that refused sentimentality. Sarah polished the cabinet glass until the Sèvres roses shone like polite witnesses who have been reminded to say as little as possible. Jessup, after a careful consultation, arranged for a wreath at the regiment's memorial chapel with a card that read simply, "In honor of courage, imperfectly understood." No signature. Whitmore called once, withdrew, and commissioned a fund in Vivian's name for nurses in colonial hospitals, an act whose public benevolence and private calculation did not quite cancel each other. Ashworth sent a letter of 12 indignant pages that Miss Marsh did not answer. He left a posy of anemones at the iron railings and vanished into the consolations of talk. Some men take the long road round grief and never notice they are walking. It was Miss Marsh who performed the last offices. On a quiet afternoon, with the blinds half lowered, she entered the Colonel's study and opened the bottom drawer. There were letters there, harmless now, domesticated by time. She read none of them, sir. She bound them with cord, sealed the packet with wax from the old taper, and placed it upon the high shelf behind the law books where dust and propriety often keep company. The room accepted the gesture, as houses do when they are asked to remember and to forget in equal measure. When Alleyn took his leave, she accompanied him to the door. "Inspector," she said, "there is more kindness in your manner than your profession demands." "Kindness is often only accuracy," he returned. "We misread less when we do not hurry." Outside, the street had resumed its proper aspect. The clatter of a cab, the discreet cough of a well-tuned motor, a flower woman whose violets were too blue for the weather. The case, in its public form, had reached the point where newspapers lose interest. In its private form, it had begun to take root like ivy in the cracks of those who had lived it. Alleyn walked a little way on foot before summoning a car. He allowed himself the small, unprofitable thought that, had someone trusted Vivian with the whole truth sooner, she might have kept it better than any of them. It is sometimes the fate of the young to bear not the future, but debts accrued in the past, and of those who love them, to pay too late. The formal business concluded itself with London's habitual discretion. The coroner's verdict, delivered without embroidery, acknowledged poison administered in tea. Miss Marsh, committed for trial, had listened with a composure that made the court unusually quiet. There had been no outcry, no scene, only the soft rasp of papers gathered and the unobtrusive movement of people who preferred not to meet one another's eyes. At the yard, Alleyn received, as a final coda, his sergeant's precise report. The toxicologist had found digitalysis in sufficient quantity to silence a healthy young heart without deformation of the features. The decanter of tincture in the Colonel's medicine drawer showed the slightest displacement of dust, the tiniest ring of evaporation inside the glass. For once, science and psychology reached the same conclusion and did not quarrel over precedents. Of Stoneman, the report offered a mild anticlimax that was, in its way, entirely in character. Interviewed, he had been all wounded dignity and gentlemanly affront. His letters, becoming suddenly shyer under official scrutiny, retreated into careful conditional phrasing. He had retained copies of everything, blackmailers often do, but their air of authority diminished the instant their tone was read aloud by a policeman. The legalists, with a tidy conscience and an eye on precedent, advised that charges might fail upon technical points. This was not especially disheartening. 2 days later, Stoneman communicated that he would be traveling for his health and expressed the hope that the matter might be closed between gentlemen. He left a forwarding address in a club at Port Said, which no one expected to be honored. One of his envelopes, delicately inked, remained on file like a pressed insect. The executors, feeling the weary tug of duty, approached the regiment. There were interviews of the most correct kind, grave nods, an exchange of receipts and silences. A quiet arrangement was reached. Mr. Whitmore, whose voice in financial rooms carried authority, advised without fanfare. He had loved the girl, and his service, now that love could not profit by it, took on a steadiness that impressed even those who disliked bankers. Captain Thornfield, his leave concluded, wrote from barracks in a hand that would have pleased the late colonel. He regretted, he honored, he declined to discuss. Mr. Ashworth, after a period of ostentatious invisibility, submitted to a modest Bloomsbury gallery, a study in muted tones. An empty blue chair by a window, morning light settling along its arm with the exact delicacy of a hand once placed there. The catalogue called it simply After. In Belgravia, the great house altered by degrees that a casual guest might not notice, and a servant would feel as keenly as a change in weather. Jessup approached Alleyn one afternoon to inquire, very properly, about references. He proposed to retire to his sisters in Bath, where there is, sir, a view that is not without benefit to the chest. Mrs. Hartwell, a fortress of competence, took the keys to rooms she had opened daily without ever permitting herself to enter. Sarah, who had first noticed a cup askew, left with an agency's card pressed in her palm and eyes that took in not grandeur but vacancy. Miss Marsh, awaiting the processes of justice, asked for nothing except that Mrs. Hartwell should continue the small charities Vivian had maintained. The bag of grocery tickets left each month at the mission, the winter shawls sent to a list of old women whose names existed nowhere but on Miss Marsh's careful paper. Her solicitor, a careful person with a gentle impediment, conveyed that request. Even he seemed relieved to carry something that resembled mercy. Alleyn returned once more, alone, to the quiet sitting-room. The blue chair had been moved back a matter of inches to make space for a new absence. The silver tray, polished now to an almost moral brightness, held no letters. On the mantel, the portrait retained its young assurance, but to certain eyes there had entered a slight reserve, as if the painter had left something out and, in omitting it, had spoken inadvertently of all that could not be said. It would be wrong to claim that Alleyn loved such rooms. Rather, he understood them. They were theaters in which the smallest gesture might signal a catastrophe, and the highest virtues could perform acts beyond redemption. Standing there, he felt the now familiar convergence of pity and professional clarity. Miss Marsh had not thought herself wicked. She had thought herself sufficient. Her love had been exact, well instructed, entirely faithful, and disastrously sure of its right to choose another's fate. He thought, too, of Vivian, not the heiress, not the figure in an evening of whispers, but a young woman who had looked steadily at a future full of admirable forms and had found behind them a weight that could not be carried gracefully. She had turned to duty and been met halfway by devotion. Between those two, she had vanished. Outside, a costermonger called a list of apples as if reciting a lesson. A dog barked twice. A hansom refused a puddle. The city resumed, as it always did, its polite indifference to individual catastrophe. Alleyn, whose business it was to notice, allowed his gaze to rest on the fine line where dust had laid itself across the window sash since last he stood in that place. It is dust, finally, that composes the honest chronicle of rooms. Not the loud chapter of crime, but the patient sentence of continuance. He closed the file at the yard with no flourish, wrote in a neat hand the single word "concluded," and set it in its appointed place among other tragedies equally tidy and unquiet. Justice would proceed along its rails. Irony had already arrived, punctual and unannounced. Of Stoneman's eventual fate, he formed no particular wish. Some men travel, some names fade, some debts are paid in currencies not recorded in ledgers. In the end, what remained to him was a chair in morning light and a teacup that, once set down, had never been lifted again. He took his hat, spoke a word or two to his sergeant that meant another day, and stepped into a London evening whose pale civility gave nothing away. Behind him the house exhaled and settled. Behind that, time arranged itself with its customary tact, and the faint film that forms on untasted tea lay unbroken, like a small, exact metaphor for what is lost and what is left